start by introducing all of you to Professor Tony Aspromourgos. As some of you know, maybe, and probably there's some gossip going. Yes, I did do my PhD with Tony at the University of Sydney. So if you have questions about that, you can ask him later. Beyond that, Tony has been working in the history of economic thought for several years. I think it's been more than 20 years and close to 30 years. He's taught history of economic thought, and he's also published extensively in the area of history of economic thought, with a focus on Adam Smith and much later and currently with John Maynard Keynes' ideas. Besides history of economic thought, he's also worked on monetary economics, and that's a talk for tomorrow, so I'm not going to spend much time on that. And he's also published 2 books dealing with the history of economic thought by Routledge. And not only that, he's on the editorial board of several international economic thought, history of economic thought journals, and he also served as a co-editor of one such international journal. So it's my great pleasure, I think, to welcome Tony to our midst, and let's welcome him.
Thanks, Alex.
So what I want to talk about this afternoon is to sketch my thoughts on why it might be of use to economists to be also students of the history of economic thought. That is, why it should be of interest or relevance to practicing economists. And I want to begin by noting 2 things. First, when I refer to economic thought, I use this term because this is the common term, but what I really have in mind is economic science, by which I mean something narrower. So what I have in mind is the object here is the self-conscious project of seeking to explain the systematic structure and behaviour of human economic phenomena, to determine cause and effect, to discover system in the form of general explanatory theory. This is an intellectual phenomenon which I take to have its origins in 17th and 18th century Europe, and to be more or less coeval with the Enlightenment. That is, having the same origin in time as what we refer to as the Enlightenment. Second, while my argument is focused on the relevance of HET for economic students, including practitioners in that, I believe that most of the argument that I'm going to present is equally applicable to the larger question of the relevance of the history of social thought as a whole for students across all the social sciences. That is to say, much of my argument could be translated from just the case of economics to the social sciences in general. On the face of it, the answer to this question, why history of economics, for short, might appear to be quite negative, insofar as HET is hardly to be found in the economics curricula of most of the, say, 100 highest ranked universities in the world. To that extent, it should be clear that the positive answer I wish to affirm goes against the grain of contemporary practice in academic economics. So I'm going to present a set of formal reasons, and then finally I'll turn to one substantive reason, and I might comment in passing. I don't want to address the question. There's an obvious question that arises if I stand here or sit here and tell you the study of the history of economics is important, and point out that it hardly looks important in the curricula of the top 100 universities or economics departments in the world. And then the question that arises is, well, then why would that be? Why would they ignore something that you think is so important? This is not a question I want to address here today, but I may make some comment in passing about what the reason might be. So let me turn to some reasons. And first, I commend the importance of studying classic texts written by the great minds in the history of a discipline. The study of the primary sources of the history of economic science enables one to engage with the few really great minds that have devoted themselves to the subject since the 17th century. And I think this is all the more important and valuable in a discipline like economics, which increasingly at all levels educates via textbooks rather than primary sources. Exposure to intellectual greatness via the classic texts in a discipline is edifying in itself and inspiring by way of expanding one's intellectual horizons. Such edification and inspiration cannot be achieved by a merely textbook-based education. Almost by definition, textbooks are mediocre because they must cater for the near to worst students in any cohort. How many great minds have there been in political economy or economics in the last 300 to 350 years? This answer is, of course, partly relative or subjective. How great do you have to be really great? But 20 to 40 probably constitutes the reasonable boundaries of where the right number lies. I suggest here a list of the top 11. 11 is a funny number, but I couldn't quite bring myself to reduce it to 10. If I had reduced it to 10, I suppose I would have to have left out Wixell. But in any case, these 10 or 11 appear to me to be the most significant figures in the history of our discipline, or my discipline, since, well, in the case of Cantillon, since the early 18th century. This justification for HET in terms of engagement with the great minds is obviously in particular about reading and studying the classic texts of the discipline. Overall, for me, these are the main focus of interest in justifying HET. But I don't want to imply by that there are no other reasons, and there are other things that one can do of importance in studying the history of a science. The transmission of ideas, the sociology of science, these are other important dimensions that I would not want to suggest are illegitimate, because my own interest is somewhat more focused, more particular. And then I would suggest that HET as a way to perspective. I think a familiarity with the history of the discipline can provide one with a sense of perspective resulting from an appreciation of the existence, historically, of a variety of possible approaches to understanding economic phenomena. And such perspective enables one also to see superficial and transitory intellectual fashions for what they are. For example, Freakonomics and other such forms of pop psychology masquerading as worthy economics. It grounds one's thinking, enhancing and deepening intellectual judgment, enabling one to grasp the deeper, more fundamental and enduring issues of the discipline. Hence, for example, in tracing the controversies in monetary economics from the currency school versus banking school debates of the 19th century to the Keynesians versus monetarist debates of the mid to late 20th century, one is able to perceive an underlying enduring issue, the question of whether or not monetary policy is capable of determining and successfully regulating the stock of money in the economy. For another example, which is on the slide, comparing the treatment of income distribution in the classical economists and Marx with the subsequently developed marginalist treatment of the same issue naturally raises a fundamental question: whether non-wage income can be understood as an expression of a social surplus, with its distribution thereby contestable and subject to determination by a wide range of social forces, or whether such income is instead partly or wholly constituted by determinate remunerations necessary to the successful functioning of the economic system, and so functional for sustaining economic activity and organisation. Well, I've referred to, in that first case, to marginalist economics, and I won't delay with a very elaborate and lengthy definition that I've provided of that here in my written text, which is available for anyone interested. I've given Alex a copy of the complete written text, and in fact the slides as well. Can look at this more closely. But here is my detailed definition of marginalist economics. It's what manifests itself in the kind of supply and demand theorising which remains central to standard economic education today, both at the undergraduate and postgraduate level, whether in partial equilibrium or general equilibrium form. I won't bother reading that to you. You can read it for yourself. Hence, one is enabled, I think, by having an historical perspective to take the long view. I teach a one-semester senior level undergraduate overview of HET, a one-unit course. And I end the coverage at about the 1960s, from the late 17th century through to the 1960s, about 300 years. And I sketch the subsequent developments briefly at the end, beyond 1960s. My rationale for ending essentially at the 1960s is couched in terms of an old anecdote about Zhou Enlai, the then Premier of the People's Republic of China, who, when asked in 1972 what he thought had been the significance of the French Revolution, replied, "It's too early to say." This is what one may indeed call taking the long view. But actually, it seems that Zhou misunderstood the question in translation, thinking it was about the 1968 student riots in Paris, not the 1789 revolution. I notice that there's some echo of the 1968 student riots in Delhi at the moment, from what I can follow in the news. Appraising the significance of theoretical and other intellectual developments in economics in recent decades will benefit from the test of a longer time frame. This perspective gained from a knowledge of the history of the discipline also enables one to better appreciate the historicity or historical specificity and variability of the subject matter of the discipline, as with the subject matter of all the social sciences. By historicity here, I mean the character of human phenomena as being historically situated and variably determined in specific temporal and geographical contexts. Fire burns the same way in ancient Athens and in modern Sydney, but the organisation of human economic activity differs radically. It is governed by different principles or laws. Humankind has a history and is subject to historical change in a manner and to a degree that does not apply to any other phenomena that we know, including other animals. That long and wide view, at least to some extent, the historical view, facilitates the transcending of the confines of one's own historically specific location. For example, in terms of the confines of an intellectual context of taken for granted beliefs, of even almost unconscious assumptions and beliefs. I suggested a bit earlier that exposure to the classic texts can expand one's intellectual horizons. It is very difficult for a student to escape or transcend the intellectual horizons of her teachers. It is difficult, but of course not impossible. If it were impossible, there would never have been real intellectual change or progress in human history. When I was an undergraduate in the 1970s, the work of the historian philosopher of science, Thomas Kuhn, was very influential. Beyond the detail of his provocative theories of how science develops, I enjoyed his suggestion that the progress of science depends on the death of professors. I have to admit that now I'm a little older, to finding Kuhn's suggestion not quite so amusing as I once did. HET can assist the process of distancing oneself from the current dominant beliefs or paradigm, just as time in a foreign country can enable one to see one's own country more clearly in its peculiar specificity. Paradoxically, perhaps, seeing it more clearly from outside and at a distance than from inside and close up. It may be added here that real-world economic crises, insofar as they lead to crises of belief, can revive interest in earlier economics due to a consequent crisis of confidence in the dominant paradigm of contemporaneous economics. Most recently, one sees this kind of revival somewhat in response to the global financial crisis. I've gone on there to talk a little bit further about that, but I'm going to leave aside those comments for the sake of time. And as I say, anyone who wants to see a little bit more of the detail can get the written text from Alex, the electronic file. Let me now turn to what I think is really the central argument I wish to make, which is in a way being prefigured already in my comments, but I think this is the most important issue that I would raise for the purposes of this question that I'm addressing. And that's about the difference between, the qualitative difference between social science and natural science, and the relevance of intellectual history that results from that difference. The historicity of human phenomena is one important reason why HET is valuable, insofar as engaging with the historical variety of economic ideas is a means of escaping the confines of one's own particular intellectual and cultural context. That historicity is also an element in the qualitative difference between the social sciences and most of the natural sciences, an issue I discussed in the epilogue to my 2009 Adam Smith book, and in an essay at about the same time on economic science and the left. The specific references and page numbers are given in my written text. I say most of natural science because the issues I raise here as differentiating social science from natural science affect some parts of natural science as well. Consider the case of psychiatry and its rather unfortunate history. Obviously enough, economics has developed very considerably since the Enlightenment, but whether entirely in a desirable direction is another matter. There are reasons why progress in all respects is not guaranteed. In the social sciences, the marketplace of ideas, this famous phrase from John Stuart Mill, the marketplace of ideas cannot be relied upon to ensure that only fruitless ideas are cast aside. One cannot confidently assume that the current state of economic science, say as embodied in the consensus of the academic literature of the last 2 or 3 decades, captures all that is worthy of preservation in prior economic thought. On the contrary, it is even possible that something like Gresham's law can be operative, with bad economics driving out good. Gresham's law is the old thing about bad currency driving out good currency. I mentioned at the beginning that I don't want to systematically address here the question of why, if, as I suggest, the history of economics is so valuable for economists, the dominant paradigm does not share this view, the dominant paradigm in the contemporary discipline. Well, one reason that you could suggest in passing is a certain naivety about social science and natural science on the part of economists. Or maybe it's something worse than naivety. Maybe it's because economists want economics to be like natural science, that they want its relationship to its history to be like the relationship of natural science to its history. This point will become clearer, I hope, in a moment. The qualitative differences between social science and natural science, differences which, in my opinion, no amount of intellectual progress could ever eliminate, are a large part of the explanation for these difficulties in the progress of the social sciences compared to the natural sciences. Economics, by its very nature, is always and everywhere vulnerable to ideological corruption or capture. Most fundamentally, this is a consequence of the fact that in the social sciences, human beings are studying themselves. As a scientific endeavour, economics in particular is virtually unique in being subject to a kind of pincer movement, which is a continual threat to its integrity. On the one hand, it deals with the distribution of material resources among humans, a subject close to the hearts of those with material interests and power. On the other, its doctrines are generally not subject in any straightforward manner to the discipline of compellingly evident facts. This combination makes the discipline attractive for and very vulnerable to such corruption and capture. The phenomenon of so-called classic academic economics articles that were initially rejected for publication, only to become hugely famous subsequently, can be a source of some amusement. There's a journal article about this subject, and I've given the full citation in the written paper. But upon reflection, this phenomenon is rather sobering, since it is likely in substantial part to be a reflection of the considerable role of subjective judgment in economics and in the social sciences in general. If we observe two chemists, one with left political views and one with right views, we do not really think this information is pertinent to the scientific status of their respective intellectual work as chemists, though it may influence the problems which each chooses to devote his or her efforts. But if we observe two economists with similarly divergent political views, we are far more likely to think this relevant to the status of their intellectual work, even if that is not inevitably so. The point to be emphasised is that the socio-political beliefs of natural scientists mostly don't matter to the scientific status of their work. They do to the work of economists. This is not merely or even primarily a matter of economists consciously pursuing ideological purposes in their work. It is due also to socio-political values influencing the work of social scientists in ways which are irrelevant to the content of most natural science. In social science, there is not a strict independence between the beliefs of the scientific observer and the behaviour of the phenomena constituting the domain of inquiry. The theories can influence the phenomena. Hence, reflecting on the history and prospects of game theory, Ariel Rubinstein, a prominent contributor to that history of game theory, notes, quote, "The fundamental difficulty of predicting behaviour in the social sciences, where prediction itself is part of the game, and forecasters are themselves players." And further, quote, "When we teach game theory, we may be affecting the way people think and behave. in economic and strategic interactions? Is it impossible that the study of game theoretical considerations in economics makes people more manipulative or more selfish? Unquote. No rock or tree or sheep has ever changed its behaviour under the influence of theories about the behaviour of rocks, trees or sheep. The capacity of theories about the social world to influence human behaviour in part hinges on human values being shaped by human beliefs about the objective structure of the relevant world, the structure of society, economy, polity. This is a vital point which I will come back to before I finish, I hope. The phenomena can also influence the social scientists. Hence, acquiescence in the particular kind of methodological individualism, which is commonplace in contemporary economics. What I mean by the peculiar methodological individualism is treating each individual's preferences as autonomous with respect to the preferences of others and autonomous with respect to the socio-economic practices and processes in which individuals engage. This is the idea of the individual agent as a kind of autonomous parameter for social theory, with the causation all going from the individual to the social outcomes, with no feedback loop of the individual being shaped by the social processes that result. That's the peculiar form. So, social science, it seems to me, is persistently prone to failures as a result of these intrinsic difficulties arising from the lack of independence between the observer and the phenomena. And these failures need not necessarily be systematically eliminated through time. Social science, therefore, is not subject to systematic intellectual progress in the same manner as the natural sciences, broadly speaking. The study of the intellectual history of the social sciences teaches this cautionary lesson. We see more easily in retrospect the role that prejudice, ideology, and so on play in these intellectual endeavours, as well as the capacity of theories to influence behaviour. This is another reason why social science has need of an understanding of its history in a way which natural science does not really need. The difficulty and danger for social science's self-study makes disciplinary self-reflection more vital to the health of these sciences, and the intellectual history is a part of that. This is not to say that there is no progress. In particular, on a strictly analytical level, there most certainly is. For example, in the formal development of price theory from A.R.J. Turgot and Adam Smith through David Ricardo and Marx to John von Neumann and Sraffa. In relation to this issue of the qualitative difference between social science and natural science, a repudiation of the postmodern attack on science by Paul Gross and Norman Levitt, the full reference is given in the written text, is instructive. It's a 1998 monograph. It is a defence of natural science alone. It thereby throws into sharp relief the qualitative difference between natural and social science. For in the end, the authors have a simple but compelling argument against the postmodern attack on natural science. Natural science works. That is compellingly true of natural science from the technological evidence of its success in a way that is not true of social science. In relation to that limitation of their defence to natural science, Gross and Levitt report what they regard as a general university opinion. And I'll give this long quote in the slide because it's difficult to follow orally. But I'm sure you can read it without me repeating it for you. Well, is that fair? Here's my editorial comment. Notice the ambivalence about economics, yeah? Sort of sitting there in between the natural sciences and the rest of the social sciences. This is also, economics likes to think of itself this way, as being a little bit above the rest of the social sciences. Notice the ambivalence about economics. But the very fact that economics is being ranked epistemologically between the natural sciences and the other social sciences suggests that economics is nevertheless, in my view, being rated rather too generously. There are parts of economics, in fact, not so different from literary criticism in terms of their empirical content. So now let me give one final edge to this issue before I turn to some concluding thoughts. And here I want to say something about the relationship between normative and purely descriptive considerations in social science. Commonly, in the manner of positivism, there is a tendency, and economics has been particularly attracted to positivism, to think of a sharp divide between the normative and the purely positive, as they call it, or descriptive. I think perhaps the relationship is more complex. So, I pursued this issue of the difference between natural science and social science in a further contribution to a symposium on a bureaucratic move in Australia to reclassify HET as a research area outside economics. This was in 2008 symposium. I did so partly by reference to the 850-page magnum opus of my compatriot Clive James, a book published in 2007 called Cultural Amnesia. Poor Clive James is supposed to be dead. He announced some years ago he would be dead in 12 months, and yet he's still with us. That's the good news. The book is a remarkable encyclopedic tribute to the humanities, especially literature and literary criticism, over the span of mainly the 20th century, built around reflections on a vast cast of characters, much of this celebrated activity occurring in the shadow of modern European totalitarianism. The fate of Vienna in the 1930s is frequently evoked. At one point, James comments on the difference between the humanities and the sciences by way of a reflection on this famous essay lecture by the Englishman C.P. Snow called The Two Cultures, 1959, where Snow tells that the humanities and the sciences have two completely different cultures. And this is James's comment on it. Science lives in a perpetual present. Science lives in a perpetual present and must always discard its own past as it advances. The humanities do not advance in that sense. They accumulate, and the past is always retained. The two forms of knowledge thus have fundamentally different kinds of history. A scientist can revisit scientific history at his choice. A humanist has no choice. She must revisit the history of the humanities all the time, because it is always alive and can't be superseded. From this point of view, I would suggest that the social sciences simultaneously share partly in the character of the natural sciences and partly in the character of the humanities, with economics deserving no higher epistemological status than the rest of the social sciences. This proposition that the social sciences share partly in the character of the humanities is certainly true insofar as the social sciences are intended to have any normative content, which of course means any policy content whatsoever. Since then, questions of ethics inevitably enter the picture. When economists engage in policy advocacy and claim to do so as economists, hence with a basis in scientific expertise, they perform something of a sleight of hand. As economists, they have no special expertise with respect to the ethical postulates that must unavoidably be embedded in any such advocacy. And there are not many economists who are at all trained in a serious way in ethics or other branches of philosophy, though of course there is an outstanding exception, Indian exception to that fact, Amartya Sen. But even to the extent that the social sciences proceed in a purely descriptive mode, they do not escape the domain of the humanities. This is so because the potentialities of the human condition and situation are a part of the actual human situation. And acknowledging that requires an expansive answer to the question of what human beings are. What is possible for human beings, including for human social organisation, is contingent upon the actually existing character of the species, setting limits to human potentiality. To approach the same point in more concrete terms, I earlier made the point that the capacity of social theory to influence human behaviour is partly due to human values being influenced by human beliefs about the actual objective structure of the world. This is so because our beliefs as to what is desirable can hardly be independent of our beliefs as to what are feasible or possible states of the world. This is the way in which our purely descriptive or positive theories can shape our values. This is the way it can happen. To take a substantive and substantial example, what is possible and desirable vis-à-vis the distribution of income between wages and non-wage income, for example, can hardly be independent of our beliefs about what are the feasible distributional outcomes in the kind of mixed capitalist economy in which we live. One could, on the one hand, believe that there is a unique competitive equilibrium distributional outcome under those conditions, which is the conventional view associated with contemporary marginalist economics. Or, on the other hand, that a considerable spectrum of distributions is feasible. One's values concerning what distributional outcomes are desirable and perhaps worth pursuing in such a socio-economic framework, whether via public policy or the policies of other organisations, could hardly be independent of those beliefs. And beyond consideration of the confines of a capitalist economy, one sees similarly how people's values are shaped by their understanding of what the facts of socio-economic life are. In a traditional two-step conservative attack on the left, the socialism which is possible, we are told, is bad, and the socialism which is good is impossible. This is one important reason, perhaps the most important, why it is desirable and valuable to revisit the great texts of the history of political and social philosophy and the great texts of the history of the social sciences, these being intersecting sets of texts for the reasons I have given: the inseparability of ethics and social science in policy analysis, and the role of human latent potentiality in social theory. One may recall in this context Keynes's, John Maynard Keynes's 1926 comment, quote, "I do not know which makes a man more conservative, to know nothing but the present or nothing but the past." Keynes is, of course, here speaking not so much of political conservatism, but first and foremost of a deeper intellectual conservatism, something which is as likely to be found on the political left as the political right. So, now I come to some concluding thoughts. The connection between our conceptions of desirable states of the social, political and economic world and our understanding as to the feasible states of the world. In terms of the latter, conditioning the former points to one further factor, reinforcing the importance of the great texts. And this in turn will lead me to conclude with one final reason for my own study of the history. The further factor is a certain natural human interest in, or imperative to develop, systems of theory intended to explain the operation of the system as a whole. Meeting what seems to me to be an intrinsic human aspiration to grasp how everything fits together. This aspiration to holism is not readily met by contemporary economics with its narrow, highly specialised compartmentalisation of the subject matter. But it is considerably satisfied by the great texts. I have here a note in addition. I include in this judgment about contemporary economics the relatively recent developments in behavioural and experimental economics. Whatever their merits as departures from the traditional a priori and axiomatic psychology of conventional marginalist economics, their departures from that axiomatic psychology, maximisation, rationality, blah, blah, blah. Whatever the merits of those departures, behavioural and experimental economics are also too individualistically and micro-oriented to offer anything at the level of understanding the system. As I commented in the very last paragraph of the epilogue to my Adam Smith book, one can look at economics with all the difficulties of practicing it successfully and conclude that it is so difficult to do properly and so vulnerable to corruption that one should abandon it. But while this option is, of course, open to individuals, it is not really available to humankind or to societies and polities. Apart from a certain low-level functionality of economics for the governance of our complex mass societies, grand socio-economic theory, in a manner of Smith, Marx, Keynes, is an almost inevitable aspiration of the human mind. We seek a unified explanation of the structure of human society, commonly with a view to changing it in the pursuit of definite and worthy ends. Policy in the largest sense. The economic dimension will always be a vital, indeed primary, element of that. And so I come to my final reason, and this is a substantive reason for why I've pursued the history of economics in various ways in the last 3 or 4 decades. It proceeds from my search for a satisfying theoretical basis or framework for enabling understanding of the workings of the economic system as a whole. An understanding in contradistinction to that of marginalism, which I regard as unsatisfactory in some fundamental respects. That search led me to embrace a synthesis of the classical surplus approach to income distribution and prices and the Keynesian demand-side approach to the theory of activity levels and growth. Koletsky should also be acknowledged in this context as a co-inventor, so to speak, of the principle of effective demand that is associated with Keynes. In coming to that conclusion myself, I was particularly indebted to the work of the late Pierangelo Garignani, partly following the lead provided by Sraffa. Arriving at such a position that a better basis for economic theory is to be found in the classical economists, including Marx and Keynes, one is naturally led to a greater interest in the relevant original texts of the classical economists and Keynes. An interest sharpened, indeed motivated, by a conviction of their continuing relevance to contemporary economic analysis. Thank you.
So, one aspect of your presentation was to distinguish between the natural sciences, social sciences, and humanities. And for me, that was provocative, to say the least, because so my interest is in philosophy of science and philosophy of social sciences to some extent. And in when we say that this kind of a distinction that human beings studying themselves and human beings studying nature is substantially different kind of a phenomenon, because when human beings study themselves, they can change. They are not neutral observers in some ways. But the same argument was actually given by anthropologists in 20th century when they visited other cultures and said that, oh, we are not part of this culture, so we are neutral observers. And that ideology has continued till very recently. Now they have started to begin in 2009. I think the Anthropological Association started saying that we are not sciences. Till then they were very adamant on saying that we are sciences, because also science has a hierarchy in terms of what can be considered knowledge and what is not. So, so if we kind of start from there and let's say, okay, no, now we have this larger understanding that it's not just about cultural differences, but human beings studying themselves can be not considered neutral. So similarly, human beings studying nature as well, not sure how much this CP Snow, two cultures is really valid, especially after 20th century quantum sciences and the philosophy that has emerged out of what you mentioned about Kuhn and Veblen and since then. So, do we still continue to think in those lines that they are actually very distinct way of doing these things? Because there is a hierarchy that emerges from this, and some obviously scientists want to hold on to it in some ways. But if we go back just before the sciences emerged in the 18th, 19th century, and there was natural philosophy and everything kind of came into that, there was much more, you can say there were a lot of polymaths, and they could get inspirations from arts, humanities for doing science, and from science to humanities. So there was much more of that interdisciplinarity. And now we seem to be stuck in these disciplines because we think that we are essentially different. Do you want to comment on it?
Well, you raised many, many issues, all of them difficult. Look, my drawing a qualitative distinction between most of the natural science, and certainly the applied natural sciences and the social sciences, is my view, but it's not necessarily a widely popular view. So, you know, there's a funny kind of tacit conspiracy here for all sorts of people with very different agendas to want to collapse the differences between the social sciences and natural science. There are people like the economists who run the discipline globally now in the American Ivy League, who want to collapse the difference because they want to say, hey, we're like them, you know? What we do is as hard, not hard, difficult, hard, strong, robust, is as hard as what they do. Not sociologists and those people, you know, they can do mathematics, but it's not hard science like economics because the data are not the same starters. So you've got those sorts of people, right, who want to sort of uplift themselves by saying, we're just like them, you know, like the real thing. And then you've got the postmodern attack, which is to say they're all the same because they're all rotten. so it's as if to say, you know, to drag the natural sciences, instead of lifting the social sciences up, we're dragging the natural sciences down to the same level. as the social science. So they're covered by ideology and, terrible muck as well. They're just as filthy as the social scientists. So, same conclusion for very different reasons. Look, I stand by my view, even though it's maybe not fashionable in some parts of the humanities, and I think it can be convincingly argued. Now, this is not to say that there isn't a sociology of natural science that reveals that it's not a beautiful, seamless progress of otherworldly people who only want to contribute to truth, right? So, we have plenty of sociology or informal accounts of the development of natural science theories which show that personal ambition and all sorts of terrible motives play a role, and corruption can occur. Not to defend a particular socio-economic system, though. It occurs to defend a person's ambition. So that sort of corruption can happen, but it's of a very different kind to the systemic reasons, I think, for the corruption of social science knowledge. And there's the second rung. I said the second element of my pincer movement that makes economics so difficult is that we don't have compellingly evident facts against which theories can be judged. Whereas, in natural science, when people act corruptly, they have to corrupt data in the end. And sooner or later they get caught. Because you have to be able to replicate. And in genuine empirical sciences, you can replicate. And you can ask an author, give me the information so I can replicate your results. So I think these qualitative differences are real. That's all I can say. But there's one other thing I'll just add, and then I'll go to your final point. I don't think we should get too hung up on the semantics, right? Saying, do we want to call economics a science? I mean, this is just a word. And in the end, the meaning of words is just a convention, So, we can make the definition. This is how I would put it. There is a definition of science that will make economics a science, notwithstanding all of my concerns, right? So you can get a definition that will put it inside the tent, right? And we can have a definition sufficiently loose or wide that everything, that natural and social, can be called a science. But it doesn't really matter what we call them. The important thing is to understand what they are in their substance. Now, economics is a systematic body of knowledge. So it is a discipline, right? If you want to say if it's a discipline, it's a science, well, then it's a science. So, there are systematic and rational. It's not just witchcraft. Don't get me wrong here, right? It's not just witchcraft. People are trying to do science, but it's prone to and vulnerable in ways in which other sciences are not. That's the point. Now, what was I was trying to think of what your final comments were that I wanted to say something about. But I've lost it now. I should have written it down. I'm sorry.
Can I just add something to when you said about the replicability of the evidence, and that's how science develops and progress? I agree with that. But what I wanted to bring is so for example, the metaphysical assumptions that go behind doing a particular kind of science. So what I'm hinting to at, if you compare what is our relationship to nature, or how do we understand nature? So with Newton and Boyle and the Royal Society, there was this understanding of nature as inert and brute that emerged, and that allowed you to engage with nature in a particular way. And if you look the aboriginal cultures or the native Indian American cultures, the relationship to nature is very different. So that wouldn't allow you to manipulate and look at nature as natural resource. So just the transformation of nature to natural resource is a way that you can do much more to nature without thinking about other issues. You think that you are only trying to study the nature, but in doing So that,
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, I understand your point, but I can't help you very much because this is beyond my competence. I think these questions that you raise. But all I could say, I suppose, is there is a dilemma here, which is really about how one approaches these things intellectually, and this whole cultural question of the sort of the cultural backdrop, which is not really part of the science, but it's the sort of it's the frame within which the science is done. So from the Enlightenment on, from, say, if you take the Enlightenment back to, as I would be inclined to Francis Bacon, right? Because there you get so that's the beginning of the 17th century, which is a bit earlier than most people would define Enlightenment. But in Francis Bacon, the Englishman, you get this idea of the liberation of humankind from necessity by the mastery of nature. So human rationality is going to, well, even the metaphor of torturing nature. You know, we're going to torture nature to give up her secrets, you know, to enable us to become autonomous. And so we just bend nature to our will. Well, of course, all of us except a few people like Donald Trump are much more nervous about this now, you know, since 1945 at least, you know, saying, well, maybe not, you know. It looks a little bit more dangerous, and now we have, of course, climate change, which is the looming kind of dominant threat to what we've done to the place, so to speak. Now, this is about values and a sort of worldview, which is, I think, is sort of pre-scientific, but is the atmosphere in which a lot of Western science has been done. But did it have to be done in that framework? I'm not too sure. This is beyond my competence. But there's one thing I will say. I've emphasised here the importance of system, of how everything fits together, and that the human mind looks for that. But there's a big dilemma. And I saw it very clearly in Adam Smith, who I spent a long time studying. Right? So, you know, apart from the invisible hand, probably the most famous Adam Smith doctrine is the division of labour. Yeah? The specialisation, division of labour makes human beings more productive. Right? And Adam Smith is very explicit that this applies to science as well. Right? So science becomes more productive by dividing itself into different sciences. And in a way, he's right, you see, because specialisation and getting, you know, different scientists to concentrate on this one little problem, you know, has been very productive. Yeah? But what gets lost, of course, is the whole system, right? And it's funny, I use it as a sort of to tell a joke on Adam Smith, because, you know, Adam Smith tried to write about everything. Right? And he failed. And so he'll say, here's Adam Smith telling us the way to be a productive scientist is division of labour. And then Adam Smith, he wants to write about literary criticism, aesthetics, the history of law, jurisprudence, economics, and on it goes. The history of science, he's got 2 essays on the history of science. And he wanted to write one more book, and then he writes in the end, I'm not going to be able to do it. Right? So he's a bit like Marx, really. You know, he said, I've got this big plan. You know, well, the plan turned out to be bigger than the man. That's the truth. So, you know, it's sort of funny. So he wants to do the big picture too, even though there's this specialisation thing. So I think if you think narrowly about the science rather than the sort of the intellectual and ethical culture of humankind's relationship to the rest of nature, just think of the science. There's a problem in there that, and in an age in which managerialism has come to the sciences, right? We have performance indicators. You have to publish, yeah? Then you don't want to sit around thinking big ideas because, hell, you think big ideas, what are you going to write? You've got to write 8,000 words tomorrow, you know? We haven't got time to do the cosmos here. You know, we've got to write 8,000 words by the end of the week. So yeah, I think there are these difficulties. Whether this is relevant to the fate of climate change and climate change policy, I'm not sure. It's an interesting question, though. These big questions are too big for me.
contradictory to that movement, because if we have something like an economic system such as Neoclassical Economics, and you're critiquing it from within the assumptions, the axioms that they presume, and so the logic doesn't hold even within their system, then why would we need to accumulate it when it wouldn't lead us to explaining the system as a whole?
I think that when you refer to the accumulation, I presume you're referring to the James gloss or editorial comment on the two cultures. Yeah. Ooh, what have I done? No, that doesn't. How do I get rid of the? Now that I've given the mouse away. Yeah, so it's the quote from Clive James, which is a reflection on C.P. Snow's two. Yeah. So I think this thing about accumulation relates particularly to, for the purposes of economics, relates particularly to the ethical dimension, to the policy dimension. So I think the point would be that as soon as one is talking about desirable states of the world, economic policy, to use the banal phrase, then the ethical question enters. There has to be an explicit ethical basis for making these policy judgments. And I think in the realm of ethics, we're now genuinely in the humanities or philosophy. And there I think it's true to say that Aristotle is as engaged in these ethical questions today. So he's not just an historical monument on the way to bigger and better things. So I think that in these areas, the accumulation is that we're always revisiting the same issues, and therefore a great thinker, even 2,500 years ago, can be read as speaking directly to the contemporary circumstance. So obviously one has to understand the context of the writings to be clear what they mean, the historical context of the writing. So for the rest, I think one returns to seminal texts because I think texts that are seminal have a rawness and an originality which makes them refreshing always. Yeah? But I think we can do what Adam Smith was trying to do better than Adam Smith did it, right? I think we can do price theory the way Adam Smith wanted to do it, far, far better than he did, and far, far better than Ricardo did, far, far better than Marx did. But I would still want to read Adam Smith and Ricardo and Marx, these seminal texts. So even in the narrow area of descriptive or purely descriptive economics, explaining how the world actually is, so to speak, I would say that it pays to revisit these books. I don't know if that answers your question.
It did, yeah, part of it. I'm still not sure about the neoclassical part of it. So, where if you're critiquing a particular school of thought,
Yes.
and you are going with the assumptions, and one way to critique it would be to say that the assumptions don't hold good. But apart from that, like from within the system itself, if you were to prove that it was logically incorrect, then is it necessary to subscribe to that? Or
So, okay, so my attitude to this question about neoclassical economics or marginalism is a bit more qualified than a blanket rejection. So, see, look, I think there are two things fundamentally wrong with neoclassical economics, and they're logically connected. The theory of marginal productivity theory of distribution, I think, is wrong, and the supply side theory of activity levels, which is just the corollary of the marginal productivity theory of distribution, I think is wrong. So for me, and now I'm just giving you a personal view, right? So, You can take it or leave it. It doesn't matter. But so that's my view, right? So this is why I prefer the classical approach and Keynes, as I said. But, you know, it doesn't mean that everything that has occurred within the framework of neoclassical economics is wrong, right? So, I mean, these are fundamental things, but they're not everything. So you look at those critiques of capital theory and say, well, you know, marginal productivity theory is all rubbish, right? Fine. But the critique, of course, has been undertaken within the same kind of conceptual framework. So the rationality of profit maximisation is assumed in the critique as well. So there's a certain sort of fundamental rationality postulate that is still in play. So that rationality postulate has not been at all contested by this critique. So you say, well, I still think rationality, as it's commonly construed in neoclassical economics, is fine. Right? So they thought it could generate a marginal productivity theory of distribution. They were dead wrong about that, right? But that doesn't mean that it's not applicable in other domains. Or you could say, well, okay, that's all true, but actually I have other reasons for thinking that the construction of rationality in neoclassical economics is no good. Right? So, you know, there are questions that remain open. So at the very end, I indicated that I thought experimental and behavioural economics would not be able to deliver this sort of answers about system-level issues. But this doesn't mean that I think it's all nonsense. Yeah, and you have to remember this. Economists who are brought up in the neoclassical framework and then do things which actually have no logical connection to that framework will tend to speak in the language of that framework. They may do so unself-consciously because they've been brought up with it. Or they may do it strategically. They say, well, these people run the world, so I'll try to do my thing in their language. Maybe I'll get away with it. Yeah? So, you know, there could be different reasons for why it's dressed up in neoclassical language. But is there anything essentially neoclassical in it? So, well, I don't want to answer that question. I don't want you to answer it. So, you know, I look at a lot of things that are happening in economics, and because what I don't like is the marginal productivity theory of distribution and its connection to supply-side approach to activity levels. I look at it and say, is this essentially connected to those postulates? And often the answer is no. It has no essential connection to those underlying postulates. So it has to be judged on its own terms. So I'm not one of those heterodox economists who says, this whole damn thing is rubbish, right? I'm a bit more careful, a bit more cautious than that. And yeah.
How do you contextualize HET to the social or the environmental context that you are living in? So what Marx or Adam Smith probably wrote or thought about was based on their understanding of the world they were living in or the context or the West. So as someone staying in India, how do I relate or how do I contextualize and theorize based on what they wrote?
Well, it obviously goes to the question of how fundamental the analyses of these people are in terms of grasping a level of humanness which and human behaviour which remains relevant in your context. That's a question. It may not. I mean, Adam Smith thought, even though he was very historically minded and was very aware of historically changing conditions through history, that he had access to an understanding of human nature, which means that at some level the analysis could have a kind of universal applicability. Obviously Marx is a bit different, but I think one has to make judgments about whether these theories, unamended, retain relevance in a specific historical context. I mean, the historicity of the phenomena does mean that doctrines become obsolete. One has to make judgments about these things, that's all. I've been in India for 2 days, so I certainly can't answer your question. Oh, there was someone at the back there, yeah.
The question is actually related to Sahana's question. So, when we studied like Gerard Damon also in his book called World's Biggest Mistake is Agriculture. So he's also saying that even now it's very hard to get in, what he's saying is very hard to get into the mainstream economics study. So I feel like Harvey is also in his book is saying the idea of new imperialism is existing in this world, and that's what practiced now practiced by very mainstream countries. So in that way, when we studied the economic history in the new economic thoughts, it makes more sense in the how the exploitations and the rapid growth of countries cannot be happen if there is without the outside exploitation of outside of the capitalism, outside source of capitalism. So they are still, it's very visible if we learn through the new economic history, the exploitation of the other countries for the resources of the mainstream countries. Even we can, if we think like that in that way, we can see even the invasion of sky. I mean, university is also we can take into part of that. So I think, is there any mainstream politics or something behind the against the new economic history to not to take into part of the main history thoughts?
I'm not sure I exactly understand the point. So, what do you mean by the new economic history exactly?
Because the history that what we study in the basic level, the basic classes, schools classes, is very not related with what the history is, the other economics talking about. So, even if I don't know which one is true, like the new economic history thoughts make more sense to the if we compare to the relevant society. So in that way, I think is there some kind of deliberate intention in not to give the information to everyone, to the main people.
I don't think I can help you with that. Yeah, I'm not really sure about this issue. I'm sorry.
How our beliefs on what's desirable can't be independent of what's possible or what's feasible.
Yes.
I mean, I'm not sure, it just seems a little weird because as a society I could, or we all could argue that a certain economic policy should be employed because it's more sustainable. But I could also argue that it's not necessarily feasible. So if you take something like if you take, for example, something like production at like local production or like localized production. I know we could all argue that it's more sustainable, that it's better for the people and all that. But it's not feasible in today's economic system that we have. So I'm not sure if our idea of what's desirable is necessarily different from what's possible.
I'm not sure whether your examples capture exactly what I had in mind. What I was trying to tell is that it's entirely possible for a human being to have a norm, an ethical value, to posit as desirable something that is impossible. You can do that. There used to be, when I first went to the United States as a student in 1980, there was this satirical show on radio in those days. Some of us still listen to radios. And it was about this fictitious small-town America, which was supposed to be the perfect, beautiful small-town America, which of course meant it was like hell on earth. And the way the show was introduced by the speaker, say, it's a town where all the men are handsome, all the women are beautiful, and all the children are above average. Every single one of them. So you say, well, I'd like to live in a world where all the children are above average. That's transparently insane, yeah, because it's just logically impossible to live in a world where all the children are above average. So you see, you could desire such a world, but who among us will do so? You know? So this is just to state in an extreme way my point, that what we regard as impossible, we will not regard as desirable. This is just not the way we all function. And what purely descriptive social science can do is to limit our understanding of what is possible. And by doing so, it will narrow the domain in which we make decisions about what is desirable. That's all, right? Now, I'm old enough to remember, but you won't unless you know it as history, the famous acronym of Margaret Thatcher when she revolutionised Britain in the 1980s. Tina, that beautiful girl's name, Tina. There is no alternative, right? There is no alternative. This is an expression of, she was lying. Actually, I'll take that back. She may have been lying, or she may have actually believed it. I suspect she was lying. There's almost always alternatives. But it's not just the politicians who will try to tell us that there is no alternative. What they really mean is there is no alternative to them, right? That's what they really want you to believe. There is no alternative to them. But I think social theory, I'm now using social theory as a broad reference to social science. I think it can serve this way as well. And I think in economics, to twist it for ideological reasons is particularly attractive because of the importance of vested interests. And so I think the argument's okay, but you have to decide for yourself.